Yeah, so just a quick introduction about me. Like, last tried to pronounce it, it's Izzudin Hafiz, but you can call me Hafiz, right? I'm a co-founder and head of engineering at Decube. And Decube is a company that provides data observability, catalog, and governance platform, essentially. And we're based out of Singapore, so it's been great visiting Australia. The cities are beautiful, the weather is much better. If you're interested, you can have a look on our website on decube.io. Right? No, okay. So yeah, so some preamble. This talk is mainly going to be about data observability, data catalog, data governance. But I do want to preface this talk. Decube's platform is built to solve a lot of these challenges, but I don't want this to be a sales pitch, right? It's to shine a light on a problem and one way of probably solving that problem, right? So that it may give you some ideas about how you can improve your own data stack, essentially, right? So the agenda for the talk today is going to be some of the typical issues for mid to large data team in the context of observability, and how data observability, catalog, and governance can solve those problems, right? And then some of the steps you can take away from this talk and try to push for data reliability in your own data stack. But before I begin, I just want to have a kind of gauge about who's in the room. Like, how many of you are data engineers? If you can just raise your hand. Oh, okay, yeah, most of you. Data scientists, any of you in the room? Or just two? Okay. Any analysts? Business, data? Okay, all right. Any software engineers, just in case we missed you out. All right, so mainly data engineers here. That's good to know. So yeah, a quick detour just in case, because that's this word, data observability. I'm going to go into it more specifically later about what it is. But just a helpful definition, before we get there, is that data observability is just understanding the state and the quality of your data across your entire data environment, right? It's not just like testing, it's more about like being able to see it, right? And this can sound easy, but when your data stack looks like that, right? You can imagine how it becomes a whole project just of its own, right? All right, so back to the agenda. I want to talk quickly about the data team and their problem. So I'm pretty sure a lot of you can relate to it, right? So a data team's main goal is going to just be creating data product, right? That can range from creating things like data marts, providing analysis, building ML models, building reports. Things. These are all, the data product that data team is trying to build. The route you take to provide this kind of data product, it can be different, right? It's going to be different for a lot of teams. But essentially, you're trying to provide service and products that are based on your data, right? The data that you collect and ingest. So there's just two main group in that data team, right? You've got your data scientists and your analysts. They are in the later stage of the pipeline. They do a lot more analysis, MLOps, report generation, these kind of things. And you have the data engineers who's there to support on the earliest stage of the pipeline, right? So you've got your data ingestion, they build out the ETL pipelines, or even building out the data infrastructure themselves, right? So what kind of problems do data team hit in terms of like observability and governance kind of thing, right? So as the size and the scale of the data grows, it becomes much more difficult to do like the trivial things, right? Things that were trivial now becomes difficult, right? So the simplest question, or the simplest problem that a lot of data teams can't even answer is, do you know what data you have, right? So sometimes that's a difficult question to answer when you have a lot of data, right? So just a quick round, like raise your hand if you can like confidently say you know what data you have, what they mean, you don't have any duplicate data set, this kind of thing. Anybody super confident that they have that? Great, we got 1, 2, all right. Very minority. Let's have a chat later, Then as the organization matures, right, i.e. it gets older, right, it's likely that your data complexity goes up, right? Things becomes legacy, but they do not get deprecated correctly. Business requirement evolves, right? And you need to move fast to accommodate this kind of things, right? And you got the hot and new technology, out in the market right now, and your team really has to adopt it, those kind of things, right? So the question becomes like, your data stacks get super complicated. There are multiple warehouses that we've seen, multiple ETL tools. God forbid, you have multiple cloud platforms as well. So it becomes super complicated very quickly, right? So just to summarize the problem, the size and the scale, right, and the evolution of the requirements, plus the ever need to move quickly, right, to serve business needs, it creates a problem where you lose control of your data ecosystem. And when that happens, inevitably you lose trust, right? Not just where the data team loses trust on their own data, right? Usually data teams are support teams to businesses. So businesses lose trust to data team, right? Even if the data team is the core product of the company, the customers then lose trust to that data team, right? So that's the main data problem, right? And I want to continue on this agenda of talking about some of the solutions that you can implement to solve this problem. So one of it is data catalog, right? So data catalog is one of those that's easy to start, but hard to keep going. The main thing, the simple statement at least, is that you need to build a catalog. What that means is that you have all your data, you ingest those metadata, you have a list of something that you can search, right? But as time moves on, the hard part is keeping it maintained, keeping this catalog maintained and in sync with the actual data set that you have, right? So what kind of problem are we trying to solve by doing cataloging, right? It's to answer the what, the how, and the why of your data, right? The data inventory, what data do you have, right? Semantic meaning of your data, how is those data actually built, right? What's the equation that's powering, like, hey, this column is the combination of two other data, right? And the business definition of your data. Your data does not live in isolation. It's not just there for no reason, right? That's a why you have that data in the first place, right? So the other question you're going to ask is like, but why do we even need a catalog, right? Because it's going to be fundamental. It's one of the most fundamental building blocks that I think you need to have a high quality, trustable, and an empowering data ecosystem, right? You cannot run an e-commerce platform if you don't have a stock of all your merchandise. You can't build a house if you don't have a stock of the building materials that you have, right? So the same is true with data products. You cannot build reliable and trustworthy data products if you can't even answer the questions, what data do I have, right? So I'm going to share with you like the #1 most popular data cataloging tool, right? You're going to be surprised, but almost everybody have access to it. It's going to be Microsoft Excel, right? It's amazing, right? It's actually, you can have a spreadsheet that contains a column with the data set that you have, the descriptions, who owns it, who's using it, who's producing the data. And if you worry that it might not be scalable, right, you can get an Office 365 subscription on top of it, share access with the rest of your team, and everybody can chip in and update one single spreadsheet. And there's even search functionality. Just press Command F and find whatever you need, right? But all joking aside, right, the reality of it is, or the scary reality of it is, that a lot of data team, their main cataloging tool is Microsoft Excel, right? And the worst part of that, the problem with that is that that Excel sheet works if your data is static, if your data never evolves, if you have all of the data you ever need, Excel is fine, right? But the truth is, your data evolves. You get new data, old data gets deprecated, requirement changes, and so does your data, right? So at Decube, right, we think that data catalog should, the #1 requirement, it should be directly connected to the data sources. So it should be connected to your primary sources, your databases, to your data warehouses, to your ETL pipeline, things like this, right? So that when the data actually changes, your catalog updates, right? So you can have a look at what's the state of your data at that moment. But it's also your responsibility, even on our platform, that you're the one who has to enrich that metadata, right? That business knowledge belongs to you. Like, no platform can automatically give you that business knowledge, right? So adding things like description, owners, certain taggings, right? Building this knowledge base for Decube at least, right? That would help power back our semantic search, right? So when you want to find back what data you have, what they mean, and why you have it in the first place, you can go back to it and find it, right? And the other bit that's important for any data cataloging tool is going to be building out a lineage, right? Because the question is always, how is your data flowing? Who's using that data, right? And a good lineage tool has to be end-to-end. If it's only partially a small bit of your data stack, you're not going to have a good picture about what's going on, and it needs to be automated because nobody wants to maintain a manual lineage, right? It goes out of sync, and then nobody trusts it, and you can't use the tool anymore, right? One of the cool use cases for data lineage is going to be like impact analysis. I'll talk about it more in a future slide. But essentially, because you get to see like an overall map of your data, you can see who's going to be impacted downstream when you make changes. Okay, so that's this bit about data observability that I mentioned earlier. So it's more about the data quality and knowing the state of your data, right? So it's a multi-faceted problem, right? The key part here is having an understanding of the state of your data, right? There's multiple facets to this. There's the volume of your data, whether your data is there on time, the freshness of it, whether the schema changes, right? You have tools like Ascend, whose sole reason or approach is going to be like schema on read, because the schema changes. You can't. Sometimes it's not reliable, right? And then statistics about those data, right? What are the expected value that you have? Whether there's duplicate data in there, right? Whether null percentages are within reason, right? So what kind of problems are we trying to solve with data observability, right? If you have any of this requirement in your day-to-day work, this is something that you're going to relate very well, right? You receive files from third-party entities, right? They could be vendors, they could be another department, they send you a file. You want to validate that the files are there, that the rows in those files are within reason. You want to validate that certain columns only contain certain values, right? That those columns do not have any nulls in them. And when they do, they're within certain percentage, right? Or number two, right? When you have to perform transformation and loading, you generally want to validate, right? You have sanity checks that you build into this, right? So things like checking to make sure that you write kind of the right number of rows, all the rows from the source data of your transformation is accounted for, and that this can get quite complicated because these checks can involve joining multiple tables to validate, right? And the last bit is going to be like, the problem of the data that you're processing, that the schema did not change, right? So if you have this in your day-to-day, right, something that you might want to have a look at is some observability solution, right? So some of the data team do implement this, right? And some of you are going to say that, hey, I do this in my DBT tests. In my pipeline, I have code that checks for quality, right? Yeah, so some of it is going to be like, you have a raw zone, and you have code and logic to check the values, to check the schemas, to make sure that it's within reason before you load it into your warehouse. And again, like transformation, you provide some sanity checks just before you load it back in, right? But certain problem needs a whole new workflow. So whatever existing pipeline that you have and you want to do the test in place, you can't easily do it, right? So for example, like volume testing, knowing how much data you're ingesting, you need an outside eye on that, right? While you're doing the pipeline, you can't calculate whether this volume is within reason, right? Because you're only looking at a small slice of it. All right, but some might argue that, hey, if I do incremental loading, I can kind of do that. But that also requires you to build like time series data so that you have historical context. That means you have to store it, right? So this becomes a challenge and it becomes a whole project of its own. So why do you need data observability, right? What problem are we trying to solve, right? And that's this word that we use a lot at Decube, is that data trust, right? Your data product is only good if it's trustworthy, right? In that, I mean that the data that you provide is correct, it's vetted, some sort of validation has been performed, right? And we've done this for a while in the software engineering world, right? It's a no-brainer. Nobody will push code to production if it hasn't gone through some testing, right? Some unit testing, some integration testing. But in the data domain, right, testing is not typical. It's the exception. When you have very critical data, then you might invest time into monitoring, right? But generally, you don't. The other bit is software engineering world as well, right? Application monitoring is common, right? You have your Datadog, your Sentry, to make sure that if things do go wrong, you immediately get notified, right? But in the data domain, that's not usually the case, right? You might have some, right? If your ETL pipeline breaks, you get notified. If you monitor your database access time, these kind of things. But do you actually have monitoring to let you know that you have bad data flowing through your pipeline? No, generally the answer is going to be that most teams don't have that. So at Decube, we build tooling to make this super simple, right? The key thing is you don't need a large army of data engineers if you have good tooling, right? Once you have good tooling in your toolbox, it becomes much easier to justify the effort of data observability, right? Data observability should be like a declarative system, right? Implementation should be low effort so that the focus can be shifted to why you're doing the observability instead, right? So it has to be low friction because or else people won't adopt it, right? One part of it is doing the checks continuously. The other bit of it is giving the visibility, right? So that's why it's called data observability, right? You're doing the checks. The other one is that you need to have a view of those checks, right? So as a data consumer, you want to know if the data you're consuming has any issues, right? As a data producer, you want to see what the downstream impact would be when there are incidents, right? And if you have a tool that provides lineage on top of observability, when there are incidents, it's much easier for you to debug the problem, right? Because you can see where the data is coming from, where it's going to be, right? Those downstream impact, it can help you manage your priorities, whether you need to solve that problem right now or you can wait for tomorrow. And one of the last bit is going to be that governance side, right? This is more all-encompassing compared to just observability, right? Data governance is more a process and policies, right, that ensure you have good management of your data, right? So it will cover things like data quality. So back to observability, data quality is also a key part of governance, right? Privacy, security, and when governance comes up, people think about compliance, but that's not the only thing that governance is about, right? The goal is to ensure you have accurate and reliable data, right? And you do this through robust processes, right? You need to protect sensitive information. You need to comply with regulation. That's one of it, right? But the other bit is that you need to make good decision-making, right? Sorry, data-driven decision-making. And you can only do that if you maintain the data quality bit, right? So at Decube, what we do is that we give you a platform for you to define your governance policies. Give somebody to own that policy for accountability, right? Someone has to be responsible for the data that they collect, or at least keep other people accountable. Something that we stress again is placing governance as close to the data as possible. It's good if you say like, hey, I have PII information, I have sensitive information, I tag that, or at least I keep track of it, but it's not connected to the data. And when the data changes, when that data goes somewhere that you did not expect, those data does not get tracked, does not stay in those governance scope, right? So another key requirement is that a data governance tool should have data lineage built in, right? Because if you tag your primary data source, like, hey, here's a bunch of usernames, here's a bunch of emails, bank account number, right? And then your DS team, your DA team, they come in, create new reports, create new tables. Those classifications should propagate downstream as well, right? And the worst case is when somebody's reading data, but they don't let other people know. And this happens all the time. So you have new tables that are not within the knowledge of whoever's in charge of keeping or making sure that this data are properly classified. So this is the last bit of the talk. So this is about helping you chase that reliability and that data trust. This is going to be the holy grail of any data team, right? To have a data ecosystem that is reliable, dependable, and above all, one that you actually trust, right? And I won't lie to you, the way forward to this is a process change and a culture change, right? I won't lie to you, say like, hey, go sign up at Decube.io and we'll solve all your data observability problem. That's not the truth, right? But I always believe that good tooling helps, right? We say it so much in the team that I think we should like trademark that somewhere. But good tooling helps because it reduces friction, right? Again, I want to take an analog to software engineering. They've been a sister industry that's quite mature, right? You don't implement software version control, right? If it's not easy to do, right? Tools like GitHub, GitLab, all this makes it very, very easy. So much so that it's now common practice, right? But it's still a process. You have to implement that process of like somebody opens up a PR, somebody else needs to review it. We need to go back and fix any issues in that review, and then only we can push it to production, right? That's the process, and GitHub is helping you do that. DevOps, those guys are like, is a whole cult. I hope there's no DevOps guys here. Yeah, there's a whole cult of philosophy and practice about delivering service and application as quickly as possible, right? So they're obsessed with reducing friction. They build tooling just so that they don't have to click a few buttons, right? Because to them, they know like friction stops adoption. If things are hard to do, nobody's doing it, right? So if you get rid of that friction, then people will adopt quickly, right? So for us in the data industry, there are a lot of problems to be solved, right? You got those ETL problems, storage problem, querying, reporting, right? Which is all dependent on your data being reliable, accountable, as well as like properly governed, right? So the first few bunch of problems I mentioned, you know the solution to it, or at least there's a lot of other people talking about the solution. As to the observability and the governance piece, right? I and the company at Decube believe that that's five things that you need, right? Number one is knowing the problem, right? You need to know what you don't know, right? And number two is knowing one way, or at least one other way, that people solve the problem. Because it helps you realize that solving the problem isn't too hard. Because if you've never seen a solution, you don't know how difficult is it going to be, right? And the third part is knowing what good looks like, right? So you have a vision of what reliable data ecosystem should look like. And I hope that this talk at least cover 1, 2, and 3, right? Gives you that first impression about data observability. And number 4 is more your responsibility, right? To create a culture and create a process, because it's up to you to push for it. And the last bit is going to be, the responsibility of platforms and tools like Decube, because it's our responsibility to make it easier for you to do what you need to do, right? So yeah, that's the end of the talk. Happy to take up any questions if you have.
Yep.